Welcome to Ashraful BDTV English Premier League Football EPL 2023-2024 Match Week 2 to Match Week 17 Full Schedule Update 2023 Match Week 2 Aston Villa vs Everton Nottingham Forest vs Sheffield United Crystal Palace vs Arsenal Liverpool vs Bournemouth, Wolves vs Brighton, Manchester City vs Newcastle, Tottenham vs Manchester United, Luton Town vs Burnley, West Ham vs Chelsea, Fulham vs Brentford. Date 19 August 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 3 Sheffield United vs Manchester City, Brentford vs Crystal Palace, Newcastle vs Liverpool, Arsenal vs Fulham, Brighton vs West Ham, Bournemouth vs Tottenham, Manchester United vs Nottingham Forest, Everton vs Wolves, Chelsea vs Luton Town, Burnley vs Aston Villa. Date 26 August 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 4 Manchester City vs Fulham, Brighton vs Newcastle, Luton Town vs West Ham, Arsenal vs Manchester United, Crystal Palace vs Wolves, Liverpool vs Aston Villa, Chelsea vs Nottingham Forest, Sheffield United vs Everton, Burnley vs Tottenham, Brentford vs Bournemouth. Date 2nd September 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 5 Bournemouth vs Chelsea, Wolves vs Liverpool, Fulham vs Luton Town, Tottenham vs Sheffield United, Nottingham Forest vs Burnley, West Ham vs Manchester City, Newcastle vs Brentford, Everton vs Arsenal, Manchester United vs Brighton, Aston Villa vs Crystal Palace. Date 16 September 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 6 Chelsea vs Aston Villa, Burnley vs Manchester United, Manchester City vs Nottingham Forest, Arsenal vs Tottenham, Brentford vs Everton, Crystal Palace vs Fulham, Luton Town vs Wolves, Liverpool vs West Ham, Brighton vs Bournemouth, Sheffield United vs Newcastle. Date 23rd September 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 7 Manchester United vs Crystal Palace, Newcastle vs Burnley, Wolves vs Manchester City, Fulham vs Chelsea, Aston Villa vs Brighton, Bournemouth vs Arsenal, Tottenham vs Liverpool, West Ham vs Sheffield United, Nottingham Forest vs Brentford, Everton vs Luton Town. 30 September 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 8 Arsenal vs Manchester City, Fulham vs Sheffield United, Crystal Palace vs Nottingham Forest, Brighton vs Liverpool, Luton Town vs Tottenham, West Ham vs Newcastle, Burnley vs Chelsea, Manchester United vs Brentford, Wolves vs Aston Villa, Everton vs Bournemouth. 7 October 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 9 Liverpool vs Everton, Aston Villa vs West Ham, Tottenham vs Fulham, Brentford vs Burnley, Bournemouth vs Wolves, Nottingham Forest vs Luton Town, Sheffield United vs Manchester United, Manchester City vs Brighton, Chelsea vs Arsenal, Newcastle vs Crystal Palace. 21st October 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match Week 10 Arsenal vs Sheffield United, Brighton vs Fulham, West Ham vs Everton, Manchester United vs Manchester City, Crystal Palace vs Tottenham, Aston Villa vs Luton Town, Chelsea versus Brentford, Bournemouth versus Burnley, Liverpool versus Nottingham Forest, Wolves versus Newcastle, 28 October 2023. Time 8 p.m. Match week 11. Nottingham Forest versus Aston Villa, Brentford versus West Ham, Manchester City versus Bournemouth, Sheffield United versus Wolves, Burnley versus Crystal Palace, Everton versus Brighton, Luton Town versus Liverpool, Fulham versus Manchester United, Tottenham versus Chelsea, Newcastle versus Arsenal. 4 November 2023. Time 9 p.m. Match week 12. Wolves versus Tottenham, Manchester United versus Luton Town, Arsenal versus Burnley, Aston Villa versus Fulham, Brighton versus Sheffield United, Crystal Palace versus Everton, Chelsea versus Manchester City, West Ham versus Nottingham Forest, Liverpool versus Brentford, Bournemouth versus Newcastle. 11 November 2023. Time 9 p.m. Match week 13. Everton versus Manchester United, Tottenham versus Aston Villa, Fulham versus Wolves, Manchester City versus Liverpool, Brentford versus Arsenal, Sheffield United versus Bournemouth, Nottingham Forest versus Brighton, Burnley versus West Ham, Luton Town versus Crystal Palace, Newcastle versus Chelsea. 25th November 2023. Time 9 p.m. Match week 14. Brentford versus Luton Town, Arsenal versus Wolves, Manchester City versus Tottenham, Chelsea versus Brighton, Newcastle versus Manchester United, Burnley versus Sheffield United, Nottingham Forest versus Everton, Liverpool versus Fulham, West Ham versus Crystal Palace, Bournemouth versus Aston Villa. Date 2nd December 2023. Time 9 p.m. Match week 15. Tottenham versus West Ham, Sheffield United versus Liverpool, Wolves versus Burnley, Everton versus Newcastle, Fulham versus Nottingham Forest, Luton Town versus Arsenal, Brighton versus Brentford, Aston Villa versus Manchester City. 6 December 2023. Time 1:45 a.m. Crystal Palace versus Bournemouth, 6 December 2023. Time 2 a.m. Manchester United versus Chelsea, 7 December 2023. Time 2 a.m. Match week 16. Wolves versus Nottingham Forest, Luton Town versus Manchester City, Tottenham versus Newcastle, Fulham versus West Ham, Aston Villa versus Arsenal, Brighton versus Burnley, Everton versus Chelsea, Crystal Palace versus Liverpool, Sheffield United versus Brentford, Manchester United versus Bournemouth. 9 December 2023. Time 9 p.m. Match week 17. Burnley versus Everton, Nottingham Forest versus Tottenham, Bournemouth versus Luton Town, Chelsea versus Sheffield United, Manchester City versus Crystal Palace, West Ham versus Wolves, Brentford versus Aston Villa, Liverpool versus Manchester United, Newcastle versus Fulham, Arsenal versus Brighton. 16 December 2023. Time 9 p.m. Subscribe to our channel to get any sports news update. Thanks for watching.